Chapter 13. Grief. I started to feel watched. Not in the paranoid sense, no shadows following me, no phones clicking on deadlines. This was subtler. A pressure in the room when I studied the wall too long. A sense that the questions I was asking had begun to generate heat. Patterns do that. When you stare at them hard enough, they stare back. I noticed it first in the way information reached me. Tips arrived before I went looking. Names surfaced unprompted. People who'd never spoken to reporters before suddenly wanted to clarify something. Always in daylight, always somewhere public. One of them slid a folded piece of paper across a diner table and told me to burn it after. "It's not a list," he said. "It's what's missing." The paper held a column of names, mid-level figures across different gangs, all familiar, all recently silent. No arrests, no obituaries, just absence. I didn't burn it, I memorized it. Back in my car, hands shaking, I realized something that made my stomach hollow out. This wasn't just someone killing people. This was someone forecasting behavior. And whoever it was, they were working faster than I could write. I split my days now, mornings at City Hall, afternoons in neighborhoods where words carried more weight than badges. The mayor's office had begun speaking in abstractions, regional cooperation, intercity tasking, shared threat environment, and they were preparing people for a truth they didn't want to say. This wasn't contained. I overheard an aide whisper the phrase outside assets, like it was a disease. That's when the second realization hit. The gangs weren't just aligning out of fear. They were running out of time. Justice. Daniel felt the compression before he saw it. The board was working. Names crossed out produced predictable distortions. Power shifted. Violence spiked, then burned itself out as confusion replaced coordination. But something else had entered the system. Noise. Information that didn't belong to either side, neither law enforcement nor gangs, was starting to circulate independently. Rumors with accuracy, observations that tracked too closely to his own. Someone was mapping the same shape from the outside. Daniel didn't panic. Panic wastes energy. He adjusted. He reduced activity in sectors that had drawn attention. Let silence do the work. He introduced delays where none had existed before, watching how the city compensated. That told him what he needed to know. The model still held, but there was now a variable he hadn't accounted for. Narrative? Grief. I started dreaming in grids, boxes connected by lines, faces blurring into functions. Every dream ended the same way, with a single empty square I couldn't fill no matter how hard I tried. I woke up one morning convinced that the story wasn't about violence anymore. It was about capability. Who had it? Who didn't? Who had mistaken force for power? That was when I returned to the father. Not as a possibility, but as a question. What kind of man loses a son and doesn't implode? What kind of man channels that loss into sustained, disciplined action without visible fracture? The answer terrified me, not because it made him monstrous, because it made him plausible. I stopped writing for 3 days. When I started again, the language had changed. Less description, more inference. I wasn't reporting events anymore. I was describing the outline of a mind moving through the city. My editor called it my strongest work yet. I hung up and sat in silence, wondering how close was too close. Justice. Daniel returned to the board late that night and stood farther back than usual. The room hummed softly, the single bulb casting shadows that exaggerated the web of connections. He studied the map not for targets, but for leaks. Which actions had been noticed? Which absences had been named, which patterns had been described publicly. Someone was close enough now to reduce his margin. That was acceptable. What mattered was timing. The reporter, he knew it was a reporter now, even if he didn't know which one, was documenting consequences without understanding origin. That meant curiosity without control. Dangerous, but not decisive. Daniel crossed off another name, slower this time. He didn't feel watched. He felt observed. There's a difference. Grief. The call came just after midnight. No ID. No voice distortion. Just a man who sounded tired and precise. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. I said nothing. "Stop trying to name him," the voice continued. "Ask how he thinks." The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, phone in my hand, pulse racing. Because the question had already changed in my head. I wasn't chasing identity anymore. I was chasing process. And process leaves fingerprints if you follow it far enough. Justice. Daniel powered down the room for the first time since he'd built it. Darkness settled in immediately, heavy and complete. The board was no longer just a tool. It was a liability. That didn't mean it was finished. It meant the next phase would require proximity instead of distance. Direct contact creates risk. It also creates resolution. Daniel didn't know when recognition would occur, only that it would. And when it did, the city would finally be forced to choose between justice as an idea and justice as a consequence. Grief. I stood at my window and watched Chicago breathe. Somewhere inside it, a man was finishing something he believed had to be finished. Somewhere else, gangs were consolidating resources, preparing to survive what they couldn't understand. And me? I was caught in the middle, documenting a war that didn't want witnesses, only outcomes. The shape of him was clear now. Not his face, not his name, but the outline of his will. And that outline was getting harder to ignore. Chapter 14. Grief. I stopped asking people what they knew and started asking what they'd noticed. It changed everything. Knowledge is guarded. Observation leaks. A bus driver told me a man had been standing at the same stop every morning for a week and then vanished. A janitor at a high school said two faces that used to hover near the bleachers hadn't been back since winter break. A bartender slid me a coaster with 3 names written in pencil and told me to forget where I got it. Absence had become data. I built a second wall in my head, cleaner than the first, quieter. No dates, no gore, just timing. The way removals preceded movement. The way fear reshaped behavior before anyone could name the cause. This wasn't reaction. This was anticipation. I realized then that whoever was doing this wasn't chasing violence. He was arriving before it. That's when the mayor's office made its move. Not publicly. Not yet. They stopped denying coordination and started managing expectations. Regional alignment. Shared intelligence. Containment posture. Words designed to soften the idea that the city was no longer in control of its own tempo. I watched aides move through City Hall like people packing a house they weren't sure they'd get back into. I watched the mayor rehearse resolve in front of a mirror, and I thought, he's late. Justice. Daniel moved the work, not the operations. Those continued uninterrupted, but the center. The room with the board had served its purpose. It had clarified scale, revealed dependencies, made the impossible feel finite. Now it did something else. It attracted gravity. Patterns that remain static become visible. So we broke it apart. Photographs came down, strings cut, names memorized, then destroyed. The map collapsed back into his head, where it had lived before it ever touched a wall. He left no shrine behind. Shrines invite worship. Worship invites witnesses. The next phase would be mobile, adaptive, close enough to feel the city's pulse without imprinting on it. He reduced his footprint, changed routes, let rumors replace presence. This wasn't retreat. It was evasion with purpose, and as he did, he confirmed what he had already suspected. Someone was mapping him. Not law enforcement. They were still chasing effects. This was different. This was someone tracking method. Grief. I crossed a line I'd promised myself I wouldn't. I followed the silence. Not to a scene, not to a person, to a pattern. 3 neighborhoods, all quiet in the same way. No arrests, no shootings, no retaliations. The kind of calm that doesn't come from peace, but from avoidance. I parked my car and walked, not with a camera, not with a notebook, just listening. A woman pulled her son inside when she saw me. A man watched from behind a curtain and didn't blink. A kid on a bike circled once, twice, then rode off fast, like he'd been told to report what he saw. I felt it then, the sense of standing inside someone else's design, not trapped, contained. That's when the thought finally solidified into certainty. He knows I'm here. Justice. Daniel saw the reporter before the reporter saw him. That wasn't luck. That was patience. The man moved like someone trying not to be seen while pretending he belonged. Too careful. Too alert. Watching the wrong details and missing the important ones. Not a cop. Not a gang scout. Curious. Obsessed. Daniel adjusted his position without moving. Let the reporter pass through the edge of the space he'd defined, just close enough to feel the temperature change. This wasn't confrontation. It was confirmation. The reporter wasn't a threat yet, but he would become one if allowed to complete the picture. Daniel didn't consider eliminating him. Not because he couldn't, because he understood something fundamental. Killing the witness would create a story. Letting the witness see only part of the truth would shape it. Narrative, he now understood, was another system, and systems could be influenced. Grief. I didn't see him, but I felt the absence where he should have been. Like walking into a room after someone has just left and knowing it without being told. The air carries memory, heat, intent. I stood there too long, heart pounding, hands trembling. This wasn't paranoia, this was proximity. I went back to my car and sat with the engine off, breathing hard, trying to decide whether fear meant danger or clarity. For the first time since this began, I wasn't sure I wanted the final answer, because final answers come with consequences. Justice. Daniel left the area without being followed. He didn't feel relief. He felt timing click into place. The reporter's presence had accelerated the inevitable. Recognition would occur, not as exposure, but as alignment. 2 men standing on opposite sides of the same fracture, staring at it from different angles. That was acceptable. It might even be useful. Daniel revised the next phase in his head. Fewer actions, more pressure. Let the city reveal who still believed in the old order. The list was shorter now, still long, but no longer abstract. Grief. I drove away with the city sliding past my windows and realized something terrifyingly simple. I wasn't chasing him anymore. I was being paced, allowed to see just enough, kept just far enough away. And that meant this story would not end when I decided it should. It would end when he did. Chapter 15. Grief. The mayor declared a surge, not in those words. He called it a coordinated stabilization initiative, which is the kind of phrase men use when they want history to forgive them before it's written. But it was a surge. Helicopters at night, patrol cars doubling up in neighborhoods that had barely seen one cruiser in months, state police assisting, federal observers standing quietly in the back of rooms, pretending not to be involved. Chicago doesn't like to admit it needs help. Now it was asking without saying, please. I stood outside City Hall while the announcement rolled out across networks, watched officers line up in formation for cameras that needed images of authority. Behind the pageantry, was panic. Inside the building, I overheard a deputy chief say the quiet part out loud. "If this keeps spreading, we lose the city." Lose it to who? He didn't say. Because they didn't know. On the street, the response was immediate. Gangs that had been consolidating suddenly felt hunted from two directions, by a faceless eliminator and now by the state itself. Meetings fractured. Couriers went missing. Young recruits were sent home instead of forward. But that didn't stop the violence. It redirected it. When pressure hits both sides of a system at once, something bursts. Drive-bys turned into running gunfights. Corners that had been silent for weeks lit up with chaotic exchanges, not organized hits, but panicked retaliation. Innocent people caught crossfire because no one knew who the real enemy was. I was at one of those scenes when it shifted from story to inevitability. A teenager lay in the street, not gang-affiliated, just unlucky enough to be walking past a bad decision. His mother knelt over him, screaming into the night, while police lights painted everything red and blue and unreal. I stood there, notebook useless in my hand, and realized something had changed. I wasn't recording anymore. I was absorbing justice. Daniel watched the surge from a distance. He had expected it. Institutions do not tolerate ambiguity for long. When they cannot define a threat, they overcorrect. They flood. They posture. They try to reclaim narrative through visibility. It would not work. But it would complicate things. The dual pressure had produced predictable instability. Gangs firing blindly, misreading each other's movements, accelerating their own collapse through panic. Daniel did not feel guilt. He felt confirmation. Systems under stress reveal their weakest points. This surge would expose which structures were resilient and which were brittle. He adjusted accordingly. He shifted operations to exploit law enforcement's blind spots, areas saturated with patrol where movement became invisible in the noise. When everyone is watching everything, no one sees the right thing. The board no longer existed physically. But in his mind, names glowed and dimmed based on the city's response. He crossed off another. Grief. I stopped going home. The apartment felt staged, artificial, too quiet to match what I was carrying inside my head. Instead, I rotated between City Hall, police precincts, and neighborhoods that no longer slept. I began noticing how often officers glanced at me, not with suspicion, but with exhaustion. They knew I was close to something they couldn't articulate. One detective pulled me aside behind a patrol car. "You're writing about him like he's a concept," he said. "Isn't he?" I replied. The detective didn't smile. "He's a person," he said, "and people make mistakes." That sentence lodged deep, because mistakes are how stories end. The mayor escalated again. Curfews, tactical deployments, joint briefings with other cities whose names were never explicitly stated but heavily implied. The subtext was obvious. This wasn't just Chicago anymore. Gangs were reaching outward, pulling in alliances, reinforcements, shared intelligence from places that had survived their own internal wars. The city was becoming a node in something larger, and in the middle of it was a single man trying to finish a job that might not be finishable. Justice. Daniel sensed the narrowing. Not from law enforcement alone, but from convergence. The gang's outreach beyond city lines had been inevitable. Survival instincts transcend geography. Old affiliations were reactivating. New resources were arriving quietly. This accelerated the timeline. Completion required decisive action before alignment solidified across cities. He revised the objective, not gradual elimination. Structural collapse of leadership across multiple groups simultaneously. One coordinated fracture. High risk, high impact, necessary. Daniel understood something now with absolute clarity. There would be no stepping back. Not after this. Grief. I caught myself rooting for him, just for a second. It happened at 2:17 a.m., standing outside a precinct after another chaotic exchange left 2 gang members dead and 3 civilians wounded. An officer muttered that maybe whoever's doing it should just finish already. I didn't correct him. That silence horrified me, because it meant the city was tired enough to consider annihilation a solution. That's when I understood my role had shifted completely. I wasn't just observing. I was becoming the only person asking whether the cost was acceptable. And if I stopped asking that question, no one else would. Justice. Daniel prepared for escalation. Not emotionally, logistically. He mapped converging meetings, identified shared safe houses, tracked which leaders were coordinating across gang lines in response to the surge. This would be the largest action yet. Not spectacle. Erasure. He stood in the dark and felt the weight of it settle. The surge had forced acceleration. The reporter had introduced unpredictability. Outside alliances had narrowed the window. Completion now required audacity. And Daniel was willing. Grief. I looked at my reflection in a darkened window and barely recognized it. Eyes hollow, jaw tight. Shoulders drawn in like I was bracing for impact that hadn't arrived yet. The story was no longer about who was cleaning the city. It was about whether the city would survive the cleaning. And I knew, without evidence, without confirmation, that the next move would be the biggest yet. I also knew I would be there, because obsession doesn't let you sit out the ending. Chapter 16. Grief. The night felt wrong before anything happened. Chicago as tells. The way traffic thins. The way helicopters hover longer than necessary. The way conversations shorten on corners where men used to linger. I felt it in my teeth. I was parked 3 blocks from a warehouse near the river, an industrial building that had been closed for renovation for 6 months, but somehow stayed busy at midnight. I didn't know why I'd chosen that spot. I just knew. Sometimes obsession sharpens instinct. Sometimes it just makes you reckless. My phone buzzed with scanner chatter, fragmented, confused, units repositioning. A suspicious vehicle reported 2 miles east. Nothing concrete. Then the power went out. Not the whole grid, just a section. Street lights flickered, then died. The warehouse went dark in a single clean blink. Silence. Not city silence. Vacuum. Then gunfire. Not scattered, not retaliatory. Controlled. Short bursts. Precise spacing. The kind of cadence that suggests purpose rather than panic. I was already moving before I understood why. By the time I reached the side of the building, the air smelled like burned powder and hot metal. A rear exit door hung open, swinging slightly, as if it had been disturbed by something larger than wind. Inside was worse. Bodies don't look cinematic when they fall in clusters. They look heavy, awkward, real. Men who had been coordinating across neighborhoods, faces I recognized from weeks of research, lay across folding tables and overturned chairs. Phones scattered, a laptop cracked open mid-message. It hadn't been a firefight. It had been a clearing. This wasn't panic. This was execution. Sirens converged too late. Officers flooded the space, guns raised, voices overlapping. Someone shoved me backward. Someone else shouted about a perimeter. But the room told the truth. Leadership. Multiple gangs. Unified for survival. Removed in one motion. The scale hit me slowly. This wasn't a strike. This was decapitation across lines. I stepped outside and leaned against cold brick, chest tight, hands shaking uncontrollably. The city had just shifted on its axis. Justice. Daniel did not rush. The operation required synchronization, not speed. Power disruption had been limited and localized, just enough to blind, not enough to alert the entire grid. Entry points mapped weeks ago. Escape routes memorized, not written. He moved through the warehouse with economy. Targets identified in advance. No deviation. No hesitation. The men inside had believed proximity meant safety. They had consolidated to coordinate defense, to pool information from other cities, to construct a counterweight to the unknown force dismantling them. They had miscalculated. Proximity creates vulnerability. Daniel removed the central figures first, not theatrically, not loudly, functionally. Once leadership fell, the rest fractured instantly, confusion replacing coordination, panic replacing purpose. By the time the final shot echoed against steel beams, the system had already collapsed. He exited before the first siren turned onto the street. Not hurried, not triumphant, complete. Grief. The mayor didn't wait for sunrise. By 4 a.m., he stood before cameras again, face pale, jaw tight. "This is an act of coordinated terror," he said. That word landed differently. Terror. It meant the city finally admitted what it was facing. Behind him, police leadership looked smaller than they had a week ago. Because this wasn't gang warfare. This was structural annihilation. I watched the press conference on a phone screen streaked with grime and blood I hadn't noticed until that moment. The narrative had cracked, and in the fracture, something terrifying became clear. The killings weren't random. They were strategic warfare conducted by a single intelligence: justice. Daniel watched the coverage without emotion. The mayor was wrong. This was not terror. Terror seeks attention. This sought completion. The operation had neutralized the coordinating tier across multiple organizations. Without shared leadership, outside alliances would collapse under distrust. Fragmentation would accelerate. The gangs would splinter into smaller units, easier to eliminate, incapable of unified retaliation. This was the inflection point. After this, resistance would diminish. The cost would rise. But the trajectory was now irreversible. Grief. I returned to the warehouse after daylight. Crime scene tape fluttered uselessly against a building that already felt emptied of meaning. Investigators combed through debris with forced calm. I counted the dead. More than any previous night. Faces I had seen on suspect boards in precinct offices. Men who had been part of something larger than themselves. Gone. In one motion. The scale changed the story. This was no longer a man picking apart a system. This was a man proving he could dismantle it entirely. I felt fear then, not of him, not even of what he'd done, but of what would follow. Because systems don't collapse quietly. They retaliate. Justice. Daniel anticipated retaliation, but he also understood something fundamental. Retaliation requires coherence. He had just removed it. The city would experience turbulence, short, violent, chaotic, but without centralized command, the gang's ability to coordinate would degrade rapidly. It was nearly done, not finished, but inevitable. For the first time since he began, Daniel allowed himself to imagine the end state. Quieter streets, fragmented remnants incapable of organizing at scale. No banners, no celebration, just absence. That was enough. Grief. Standing there in daylight, surrounded by forensic teams and flashing cameras, I finally saw him, not physically but clearly. Not a monster, not a madman, a strategist. A man who had chosen eradication over coexistence and possessed the discipline to pursue it. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether he could be stopped. It was whether anyone left had the strength to try.